Hi students, welcome back. In this segment, we are going to be looking at that part of economic flows which does not always have to be related to the movement of money or the movement of finance or even the movement of products. Instead, we are looking at three categories of things. One, corporate structure. Two, the flows of people. Three, the flows of ideas. Okay, so there are other kinds of very interesting movements related to the economic and financial world which we see really traveling across the world and having a huge impact as they travel. Okay, so for instance, the text mentions how till the 1970s, there was a particular type of corporate structure, particularly, let's say, from the beginning of the 20th century onwards till the 1970s, there was a specific type of firm which was very popular, and it was organized according to Fordist principles. Okay, now in this kind of a firm, I mean, the structure of the company used to be such that the idea was that, once you're employed in the company for your whole life. Okay, and there is going to be someone at the top who was like a very clear chain of hierarchy was established. It was very clear who was at the helm of various things, and that was the way in which the company used to be structured. However, since the 80s onwards, what we really see is the emergence of a very different type of corporate structure, and that structure has become so influential that it has really traveled to many parts of the world. So, for instance, today you will find many companies proudly declaring that they are very flat organizations. There is a flat, I believe the term is flat hierarchy. So, basically, that there is no hierarchy, everyone is like a happy co-worker who works with each other. Okay, but the idea also is that, the companies themselves are to be quite fluid, which means that, they will now try and diversify and invest in different types of businesses. That is considered to be a sign of a robust company. Okay, also the people who work in the companies themselves are expected to be fluid, so and flexible, which means that if you start working in a particular company, it doesn't mean that, you're even going to stick around for the next 5 years. It may be that, so the focus becomes your career trajectory rather than your commitment to the company, and vice versa. The company may also insist, not may, it does insist that, we're going to hire people on a contractual basis. If you don't perform, you're out and we'll hire someone else, right? So that corporate structure has really changed significantly, and it's an idea also that has caught on. Okay, the text also notes very, very interestingly the movement of people, and specifically it talks about a certain type of people called MBA students. Okay, so the popularity of the MBA as a program, and in fact today some of the brightest minds, once you complete your basic education, often gravitate towards a degree in management. Okay, and that's because, of course, management has emerged as a very popular career choice. It's considered to be something that, the perception at least, is that once you do an MBA, you're definitely going to get a job. Reality may or may not match the perception, but that feeling is definitely there. Okay, and certainly there is an idea that if you go in for an MBA, then your employment is not going to be restricted to the market that exists in the place where you live, but you yourself may become a much more mobile person and travel to various parts of the world. But the book also mentions, I mean, I think it's what happens in MBA schools is also that you are taught to approach businesses and business problems, or even economic problems. All economic problems are not always business problems, in a very specific way. So you have to take the prism of management. Okay, and that approach can be applied to various sectors where these MBA students may go, right? So for instance, an MBA student may have a degree in management but end up in working for a municipality, and there they would actually apply the management approach rather than a different equity approach, for instance. Okay, so therefore it's a very interesting phenomena. In fact, in the chapter on neoliberalism, we are going to look at just how influential the travel of people can be, because it is through people that some very significant in the economic sense ideas have moved from place to place. I'm talking about people who were trained in the Chicago school and then made their way to to hold very important positions in South American countries. We will look at that trajectory very carefully in the next chapter. But I think suffice it to say that although the movement of people is not what comes to mind immediately, or certainly the movement of students is not what comes to mind immediately when we are talking about economic flows, actually it's a very, very significant aspect. Okay. And finally, the text also talks about the movement of ideas, and again these are management ideas. So for instance, I did not really get a chance to talk about this in the chapter where we covered it. You remember I spoke about just-in-time management as a type of Easternization. Now, just-in-time management is something that is a particular philosophy of management that was developed by Toyota, and essentially through their experience in producing cars in Japan. But when the company moved and started acquiring and setting up production facilities in other parts of the world, this philosophy moved with them. Very soon what happened was that this just-in-time philosophy, which originated in the automobile industry, started to move to other industries as well, where Toyota had no presence. Okay, and of course it moved. It became very, very popular in the United States at one point, in other economies also at one point. So although we may not think of this as an economic flow, it's a very interesting way of doing a business which is moving, and it's not as if it is Toyota as a company which is pushing it down the throats of different companies. It in some ways is a way of doing business that just caught on and started to get adopted at various places. Okay, so therefore again the flow of these management ideas are an interesting example of how influential ideas can be when it comes to eventually what kind of economic flows we can see. I think we can end this chapter with a discussion on a last set of phenomena which have to do with consumption. Now, you may wonder why we are talking about consumption here. So, up until the let's say 1960s, 1970s, the world economy was really focused on being a production economy, right? So as we discussed earlier, the goods that you saw were tangible goods, and economies prided themselves on being production powerhouses. Okay, but a change soon came over some of the largest economies of the world, where the focus started to be on consumption. In fact, in another text, Ritzer gives a really brilliant example where he says, if you compare the reaction of the American president to two different recessionary events, it becomes very clear. So in the late 1920s, when the Great Depression hit the United States, the American president held up the need for production as the only solution that would get the American economy out of this problem. In contrast, in 2008, when that recession hit the United States, that recession that we were just talking about in the last segment, the then American president, George Bush, had a very different mantra. He said, go out. My advice to Americans is go out and spend more. The more you spend and buy stuff, the faster our economic activity will be jump started, and we will be able to recover. Okay, so this just should give you an indication of the types of activities that have over time become to be considered as crucial to national economies. And for a long time, it was actually just focused on production. The more metals that a country produces, the more industrial output that a country produced, or the more agricultural output that a country produced, the more prosperous and richer that country was. But in the recent past, since the recent past, consumption in itself has considered to be a driver of economic growth and change, and that model seems to be spreading rapidly across the world. It is in that context that Ritze actually offers us two analytical terms. The first is hyperconsumption, or buying more than one can afford, and he talks about how, like, whether it is through popular culture or whether it is through perhaps sometimes even government advice, through various quarters of influence, actually, this idea is really impressed on people that the way, for instance, now a very common way of showing how successful we are is by showing how many brands we possess, right? So what that does also is to create hyperconsumption tendencies, whereby people are encouraged to buy much more than they can afford to buy. But there is this drive that is, like, for instance, a type of, if you look at pop psychology, something that is often suggested when you're feeling sad is retail therapy. Okay, so again, this is an indication of this kind of hyperconsumption, a broad emphasis towards consuming more and more, even if you cannot afford to. Like, for instance, in that housing bubble that we were just talking about, people were being pushed to buy, not pushed in the forced sense, but they were being encouraged to buy houses. They were being told, hey, it doesn't matter what your income is, just go and buy the house, it's available, it's cheap, just buy it. Okay, it's really, there are some very good documentaries on that crisis which establish this. I mean, so why did the housing market crash in itself is a very interesting question. And what Ritze says is that this tendency towards hyperconsumption, of course, is driven by another process which he calls hyperdebt. And hyperdebt refers to owing more than one will be able to repay. Okay, so what fuels this kind of drive towards hyperconsumption? Very often it is hyperdebt, right? In fact, in the context of this US recession, or not US recession, it was the global recession of 2008, but really centered around the US economy. What also happened was that people were being encouraged to subscribe to as many credit cards as possible. In fact, in his other book, Expressing America, if you remember, we did that. We discussed it a few chapters back. Ritze writes about how for a while, for many people, it was very common. Every time they opened their mail, there would be 20 pre-approved credit cards in the mail. Okay, and of course, this had an impact on the psyche of the people as well. They thought that it was okay to actually take on more and more debt to fuel their consumption, and neither of which they could afford. So these are also some very interesting tendencies that or processes which have shaped economic flows in the contemporary phase of globalization.